Today's reading is from John chapter 20, verses 1 to 2 and 11 to 18. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. This is the word of the Lord.
What do we see in the first hints of day? In that moment when darkness is still heavy and shielding.
But there's a sliver of light, a glimmer of something coming. The hope, the promise of dawn. Not yet sunrise, but daybreak, first light. The darkness of the tomb deepening against the coloring sky.
Our eyes startle as we peer into the cell, blinking away the shadows and the tears. For we are there with the women and their spices.
We are there with the same questions and the same grief.
We are there with our confusion and anger and doubt, blinking in the dark,
beginning to see the light.
We want an angel announcement too.
We want the comfort of those words.
Don't be alarmed, and he is risen, and you will see him just as he told you. First light, hint of day.
Hope of revelation and resurrection.
Open our eyes. Light of the world, give us new sight.
Fill us with faith. With Mary and Salome, we tremble, bewildered,
but flooded with joy.
Good morning. I wonder when you have some time to kill, when you're waiting for a flight at the airport and you have a little time to kill, what do you tend to do with that time? For me, I usually end up kind of taking laps of the airport, and I always end up going into the bookstore, which can be a pretty dangerous thing to do before a flight. It's sort of like shopping when you're very hungry, grocery shopping. So it's like, yes, I'm definitely gonna read these 6 books on this 90-minute flight. Seems about right. But I usually just skip that, and then I just settle for buying a $14 bottle of water instead and enjoying that. But a while back in one of these bookstores, I came across a book that at that time was really everywhere. It was a big bestseller. It was called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. And it's one of those very interesting and very ambitious books that tries to distill sort of the entire human story through a single lens. And the author argues that what makes us as human beings, what makes us very distinct, is our ability to cooperate with each other in very large numbers. And what enables that kind of cooperation? Well, he says it's our capacity to believe in shared stories. And here's what he says, and this touches on religion. He says in his book, there are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no human rights, no laws, no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. And so according to Harari, religion is simply a product of our collective imagination as human beings. Essentially, we might say a useful fiction that allows us human beings to organize ourselves. And that's kind of an appealing idea to many of us in our society today because it touches on what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls our secular age, where belief in God is just one option among many, and it's often not the most plausible option. And so now, on a day like this, Easter Sunday, which is the day when Christians around the world make this audacious claim that there was once a man who died and then came back from the dead, when we think about the claim of Easter, then of course a book like Sapiens seems even more compelling. Isn't the resurrection just another useful fiction? Is it just another metaphorical story of springtime hope? Is it a narrative created by well-intentioned but confused early Christians in the first years of the faith to sort of invent this story to make sense of their loss and to make sense of their lives? Fair questions. But I want to suggest something a little bit different. That what if the Easter story isn't just another myth or another metaphor, but what if it's something that actually happened in history? That what if it's not just about a story that happened to Jesus, but what if it's also about what can happen to you? And so we want to explore this passage in the time we have today and look at three life-changing truths from that first Easter morning over 2,000 years ago. And these life-changing truths, I believe, can alter everything about how we live when we actually leave this space today. Before we talk about the power of Easter, we have to first ask the question, did it actually happen? Because if it didn't, then nothing else that we're going to say today actually matters. And so the first thing that we want to discover about Easter, that we want to say is, this is real. It says this in our passage, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. I like that. If you're writing, he's writing about himself as the one Jesus loved. Very humble. And said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him. Jesus is gone. I remember having coffee with somebody several years ago, and he said to me, Ben, I appreciate so much about Christianity. Like, Jesus is great. I love his teachings, his ethics, his way of approaching the world was amazing, but the resurrection, that's just a little far-fetched to me. That's sort of where you lose me. And I get it. Like, I really do get it, because we've been conditioned by pretty much everything around us, from our education to really the whole cultural ecosystem, to see the resurrection either as a beautiful metaphor or as an ancient superstition. Something that maybe less sophisticated or less enlightened people might cling to for hope, but that we've sort of outgrown. Like, we've developed beyond that. And so the resurrection can be oftentimes one of the biggest stumbling blocks to faith, because, I mean, dead people stay dead, right? Isn't that just how the world works? Isn't that how the real world works? But what if our understanding of what if our understanding of reality itself is actually too small? What if we're sort of like people who've lived our entire lives in a tiny windowless room, convinced that nothing else exists beyond those four walls, until one day someone opens a door we didn't even know was there? The resurrection is either the most important event in human history, or it's not. It's quite binary. There's no middle ground. And so what we want to do here as part of this first point is just to name a couple elements of evidence. Now, the topic of evidence is massive. There are many books thick books written about this topic. We don't have time to really honor it fully today, but just want to consider a couple pieces of evidence for the resurrection. And the first, just we see it right in our passage here, is that's to consider who discovers the empty tomb. Now, all four Gospels place women as the first witnesses of the resurrection. Now, here's something about the ancient world that probably makes us very uncomfortable as modern people. But in that first century culture, women at that time and in that place were not considered reliable witnesses. Now, that's awful and that is wrong, but that's how it was. That's how the culture was. The testimony, we have records that say that the testimony of women wasn't even admissible in court as evidence in that era of history. And so now think about that very practically, that historical background. Now let's say that you were bold and you wanted to create your own religious movement. Now, I don't recommend it, but if you're very audacious and you wanted to do that, let's just say you did, and you said, as your sort of the crescendo of your movement, you were going to invent this wild story that your leader, who everyone had seen publicly executed, it was well documented, that your leader was going to rise triumphantly from the grave, and it was going to be a tremendous spectacle, and you want to invent that kind of story. Here's the thing. You would never, ever make women your primary witnesses. And yet, all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have women front and center. Why? Because they're not trying to craft a strategic narrative. They're recording as if this actually happened, even though it weakens their case from a cultural credibility standpoint. Historians call this the criterion of embarrassment, and it's one of the strongest indicators of historical authenticity. And so there's, first of all, who discovers the empty tomb, but second, there's the transformation of the disciples. Now, let's be honest, we think about the disciples, but the disciples, before Jesus is arrested, when he's arrested, they're not exactly spiritual giants. They weren't heroes, they weren't brave, they were ordinary, flawed people who completely abandoned Jesus when things got dangerous. Peter, one of the main disciples, denies even knowing Jesus. And it's not that he was being threatened with torture or death or something. No, he was being questioned by a young girl. And she's like, hey, guy, aren't you one of those guys who was hanging out with Jesus? Wasn't that you that I saw? And he's like, no, me? No, absolutely not. I don't even know who that guy is. You know, is it getting warm in here? That's not in the Bible. I made that part, to be clear. Don't say Ben invented new parts of the Bible during Easter. After the crucifixion, the disciples are so scared that they're literally hiding behind locked doors. Hardly the makings of a great movement. But then something happens. Within weeks, the same men were standing before the very authorities who had executed Jesus. Now they're boldly proclaiming the resurrection. Peter, who couldn't even admit his connection to this young girl, is now willing to be arrested, beaten, and we believe eventually brutally executed rather than deny the resurrection. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't that the disciples had anything to gain materially by proclaiming the resurrection. They didn't get rich. They didn't get a book deal out of this. They didn't get speaking engagements. They got crushed. And so what explains this kind of transformation? It would be kind of like watching the Jets win the Super Bowl. You would need a pretty compelling explanation for how that happened. You know, people have proposed alternate versions of like how this worked and like kind of explain away why the empty tomb. And for some, one common proposal is just that they went to the wrong tomb. Like innocent mistake, they were trying, but they found, they were confused, they went to the wrong tomb. Here's the thing though, wouldn't the authorities simply have produced Jesus' body then from the right tomb? Since they knew where the right tomb was, to silence and stifle this annoying Christian movement? Or maybe did they hallucinate? After all, they're grieving, they're tired, they're overwhelmed, like they're stressed out. But hallucinations, don't work that way. A hallucination is an individual psychological experience. It's not a group phenomena. For the disciples to have the same hallucination at the same time in the same way over a period of 40 days and with 500 plus witnesses, that would be a miracle in itself. I mean, have you ever tried to coordinate group dinner plans over text message? Like, it's hard enough getting 5 people to commit to dinner plans, let alone orchestrate a 500-person strong hallucination. Or maybe they were just intentionally deceiving people. They knew, the disciples knew that they were creating a myth. They were just creating fiction, maybe. But myths take generations to develop. The earliest Christian proclamations about the resurrection began immediately, within days of the crucifixion, not decades later. And so it's very hard to explain the rise of Christianity without factoring in the resurrection. Even the author that we mentioned earlier, Yuval Harari, author of *Sapiens*, he admits the confusion about how Christianity took off. And this was from actually a recent podcast that I was actually just looking at last week. Let's take a look at this interview from the author.
History is full of accidents. How did Christianity become the most successful religion in the world? We can't explain it.
So
Why this story about Jesus of Nazareth and not, the Roman Empire in the 3rd century CE was a bit like, California today. Like so many sects and subsects and gurus and religions, like everybody has their own thing.
yeah.
And you have, thousands of different stories competing. Why did Christianity come up on top? As a historian, I don't have a kind of clear answer. You can read the sources and you see how it happened. Oh, this happened, and then this happened, and then Constantine adopted it, and then this, and then this. But why? I don't think anybody has an answer to that. If you rewind the movie of history and press play, and you rewind and press play 100 times, I think Christianity would take over the Roman Empire and the world maybe twice out of 100 times. It was such an unlikely thing to happen.
No, I'm not suggesting, when we talk about the resurrection, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we can mathematically prove the resurrection like a geometry theorem. But I'm just saying that we can't just dismiss it as obviously fictional. Because what if it's true? What if Jesus did actually rise from the dead? Well, as the scholar N.T. Wright concludes, after thousands of pages of historical analysis, he says, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. And so if this is true, it would mean, if the resurrection is true, it would mean that reality is bigger and more mysterious than we ever thought. It would mean that a materialist view of life, that physical matter, what you can see and taste and touch, that it's all there is, it would mean that that view of the world is not sufficient to explain the world we live in. And so couldn't that mean, if all of that is possible, that there's actually a being out there beyond us, that there's actually a God who steps into human history? You see, the gospel accounts, they're not written like myths. They're not written like fairy tales. They're filled with specific details, with names and places and interactions and dates. They read like eyewitness testimonies, not like once upon a time. And yet, if you're skeptical, if you're like, I don't know, that's okay. But I want to graciously challenge you to examine not just the historical evidence, but also to examine your own resistance. Like, what's at stake for me if the resurrection actually happened? What would it mean for my life? And so on one hand, it's very important to investigate the evidence for the resurrection. At the same time, I'm well aware that there's no argument that we could make today that would fully convince somebody, because evidence alone doesn't change your life. But Easter isn't just about believing that Jesus rose. It's also about an encounter. Historical truth like this only matters if it actually leads to personal transformation and change in your life. And so we know that this is real. We believe, Christians believe that this is real, but second, that this is personal. Keep reading. It says, now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been. They asked her, woman, why are you crying? They've taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they've put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for? Thinking that he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. You know, one of the things that I've seen as, well, just personally in my life, but I've seen as a pastor as well, is that many times when people struggle with faith, it's rarely just an intellectual barrier. It's very often existential. It's very often personal. You know, Blaise Pascal once said that the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. Now, I wonder if you've ever had the experience of looking right at something, but kind of not really seeing it. It's sort of like when I stand at home, when I stand in front of the fridge and I ask my wife, hey, where's the ketchup? And then she says it's on the lower left shelf, and I look, and I look, and I look, and nothing is there. And then, it's incredible, she walks over, and like that, the ketchup magically appears exactly where she said it was gonna be. I don't even know how that works. But it's there, but I can't see it. Or how about this? Maybe you've seen this famous illusion before. It's from an old German magazine from the late 1800s. What do you see, a rabbit or a duck? Well, it's both. But typically, we only see one at a time. Why? Because our brains struggle to hold two interpretations at the same time. That, I think, in a way, is what's happening to Mary. She's looking right at Jesus, but she's not seeing Jesus, she's seeing the gardener, because there's some kind of lens that's preventing her from seeing what's really there in front of her. Because there is a lens. Mary's crying. The passage mentions her crying 3 separate times. Her vision is blurred, physically blurred, emotionally blurred. That's what grief does to us. Grief is sort of like wearing glasses with the wrong prescription, where everything else is distorted. Nothing looks right. But here's what's so beautiful. Jesus in this passage doesn't just wait for Mary to connect the dots. He doesn't just wait for her to recognize him. He takes the initiative. He speaks her name, Mary. One word, her name, and everything changes. She turns toward him and she cries out, Teacher. Jesus, it's you. See, there's something, we know this in our own lives, there's something so comforting, there's something so personal about hearing your name lovingly spoken by someone who knows you, who cares about you. It has this uncanny power to just cut through the fog. That's what makes the resurrection so powerful, is that Jesus doesn't just rise from the dead as a general principle. He rises to call specific people by name, to call you by name, to call me by name. Many people think that Christianity is primarily about affirming certain doctrines or following a particular set of laws or rules, but at its core, Christianity is all about an encounter with a living God who wants a personal relationship with you and who knows your name and who calls you into a relationship. In other words, don't settle for knowing about God instead of knowing God. Mary doesn't just know facts and figures about Jesus. See, Mary Magdalene has walked with Jesus. If you read the Gospels, her life has been transformed by Jesus radically. And so when he spoke her name, it wasn't just sound waves hitting her eardrums. This was recognition. It was connection. It was relationship. And isn't that the very thing that as human beings that we long for, that we want to be seen? Now, you might be thinking, well, that's great for Mary. I'm very happy for her. But she, after all, got to see Jesus face to face. But what about me 2,000 years later? How do I experience a personal encounter with him? How do we experience the personal power of the resurrection in our lives today? And just 3 quick things I wanted to recognize from this passage. The first thing, if you want to really have that personal walk with Jesus, first of all, we have to recognize our blindness. Mary can't see Jesus even when she's staring right at him. And so what's blinding us today? Maybe it's grief. Maybe it's hardship that we're walking through that we can't see anything else. Maybe we're blinded by our own ambition and by our drive for achievement. Maybe we're blinded by our need for comfort or for control. Maybe it's the numbing effect of our digital age where our screens keep us constantly distracted but never really present. Maybe it's frankly just a general lack of expectation around anything supernatural at all. That all there is that exists is what I can see and touch in front of me. But keep in mind, it wasn't that Mary necessarily had high supernatural expectation either. She wasn't logically expecting her next move to be like, I'm going to see Jesus back from the dead. That wasn't in her agenda for the day. And so we have to recognize our blindness. Second, we have to recover the art of listening. Notice that Mary's recognition of Jesus, when it like snaps into gear, that's Jesus. It doesn't actually come from physically seeing Jesus. It comes through hearing. Mary, Jesus says, and suddenly her eyes, it's as if her eyes, physical eyes, and the eyes of her heart are opened. You know, the first Christians didn't really call themselves Christians. They actually called themselves followers of the way. That there was a way of life, a way of being in the world that Jesus was inviting people into. And Jesus, when he invites people into his way, Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice. My sheep hear my voice. Not my sheep read books about me. My sheep have discussions about my life. My sheep affirm correct doctrines about me, but my sheep hear my voice. And so what if actually Jesus is actually speaking your name right now? What if he's speaking our name right now, but we just can't hear his voice through all the noise of life? Right, so recognize our blindness, an ability to listen, and then third, to respond with recognition and reverence. You know, when Mary hears Jesus call her name, the passage says that she turns towards him. In other words, there's a physical reorientation of her life. Encounter demands response. It requires turning from everything else to face Jesus directly, which is really, really hard in a casual, consumer-oriented society because we're not sure we want to turn toward Jesus. We want a Jesus to turn toward us. We want Jesus to fit into our lives. We want a Jesus who affirms our existing priorities, who makes us feel better without requiring anything from us. And I get that, and I get that way of thinking. But the risen Jesus, the Jesus of Easter, doesn't come to fit into my life. He comes to become my life. He comes to make us more and more like him. And so when we talk about Easter, we believe this is real, this is personal, but third and finally, that this changes everything. Mary Magdalene, it says, we keep going in our passage, the end here. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I've seen the Lord. And she told them that Jesus had said these things to her. When Jesus calls Mary by name in that garden, it wasn't just a private spiritual moment. It was the hinge on which history turns. From that From that single encounter comes a movement that transforms the world. Her message, the message of this ordinary woman reporting back to the disciples about what she's witnessed, that message actually sets off a ripple effect that's been advancing in human history for 2,000 straight years. Mary Magdalene becomes what the early church fathers called the apostle to the apostles. The first witness, the first messenger of the resurrection. You know, the writer and scholar George Weigel wrote about the historical impact of the resurrection in the Wall Street Journal a number of years back. And he was describing sort of, again, the ripple effects in history of this Christian movement, how Christianity went from a fledgling group of, persecuted people, very much in the minority, to about half the population of the Roman Empire by the early 4th century. And here's how he put it. He said, "There is no accounting for the rise of Christianity without weighing the revolutionary effect on those nobodies of what they called the resurrection. They encountered one whom they embraced as the risen Lord, whom they first knew as the itinerant Jewish rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, and who died an agonizing and shameful death on a Roman cross outside of Jerusalem. The first generation answered the question of why they were Christians with a straightforward answer: because Jesus was raised from the dead." And then this is important. It says, as they worked that out, their thinking about a lot of things changed profoundly. Weigel calls all of this the Easter effect. That the impact of the early growth of Christianity only makes sense if the first followers actually believed in the physical, literal resurrection of Jesus. And he goes on to point out just a few of the breakthroughs that happened in society that Christianity brought to the ancient world. He talks about a new dignity that was given to women in contrast with the classical culture of that time, a dignity that Christianity gave to women. He talked about this self-denying kind of healthcare that Christians gave to plague sufferers in that time. He talks about the remarkable change in worship on Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, which was so radical that would be the equivalent of us changing July 4th to July 5th. Talks about a willingness that Christians had to embrace death, even death, painful death, as martyrs, because they knew that death didn't have the last word over their story. They were living, he says, that early Christians were living as if they knew the outcome of history itself. Christianity was a radically inclusive missional movement, unlike other much more insular religions of that time. Christianity brought the concept of human rights, since people were made were not just pawns to be used, but people were actually made in Christian theology in the image of God, the Imago Dei. This is why Easter changes everything, because it's not just a historical claim or a spiritual metaphor. It's actually the foundation for a comprehensive worldview that addresses our deepest questions and our highest aspirations as people. It speaks to the fear of death with the promise of life. It speaks to our hunger for justice with the assurance that wrongs will be made right. It speaks to our desire for meaning with the invitation to participate in redemption. The resurrection means for us today that your success or your intelligence or your self-sufficiency, as great as they might be, as impressive as they might be, can't save you. It also means, on the flip side, that your failures, that your doubts, that your mistakes, that your wrongs, that in the language of the Bible, that the Bible calls sin, that even those things, as painful and difficult as they might be, they can't condemn you either, so long as you place your hope and your trust in the person of Jesus. The resurrection, in other words, is not just a doctrine to affirm, it's actually a reality to live in. And I'm amazed by some of the things that I'm seeing in the news these days, because something is happening, something is stirring in our culture today. As people, I believe we're hungry for something that is ancient and unchanging. For example, the very generation that we've been told is lost to faith, Gen Z, is leading a spiritual renaissance in this country. Bible sales across the world are skyrocketing and surging to record heights as people grapple with anxiety and with a need for meaning. Even in hyper-secular Silicon Valley in California, there are all these reports of churches and various Christian gatherings sort of like exploding, bursting at the seams. There's a massive hunger to explore Christianity in a way that's really never happened before. That there's no paradigm, there's no framework for. Why now? Why is all of this sort of bubbling up right now? I believe it's because the emptiness is deafening. As one writer observed in one of these articles, beneath Silicon Valley's material affluence lies, quote, deep loneliness and, quote, spiritual poverty. I believe the same thing is true in a region like ours, where we are climbing ladders that lead us nowhere. And yet God isn't surprised by any of this. God actually designed this hunger, this desire for more than we've currently experienced. God actually placed that inside of us as part of our DNA. And something is happening. Many are discovering Jesus. Many are discovering what the characters in our passage today were discovering all of those years ago, that this is real and that it's personal and that it changes everything. And in a place like this, in a region of the world, in a region of the country like where we are today, where we've mastered the art of success by pretty much every conventional measure, many of us too are rediscovering what actually matters most. Like Mary at the tomb, we are hearing our name called by the one who sees beyond our performance to who we really are. The resurrection is not just true, it's what you were made for. That the same power who raised Jesus Christ from that tomb, from the dead, is available to transform you, to heal what's broken, to renew what's weary, to resurrect what's died in your life. Not just some distant, ethereal future, but actually beginning right here and right now. The cross, in other words, is an invitation. Jesus offers his life for your life. The only thing that you need to do is to accept his offer in trust. Not lots of knowledge. You don't need lots of knowledge. You don't even need a good-looking life. You just need to believe that Jesus is who he says he is. Just like now over 2,000 years ago on another Sunday morning, just like Jesus spoke Mary's name, Jesus is speaking your name today. God knows you so well because he actually created you. He knows how you're wired. He knows your hang-ups. He knows your quirks. He knows your cares. He knows your hurts. He knows your hopes. He knows your dreams. And he is standing there before you with open arms today with this gift of grace. He's speaking our name. The question is, are we listening? He's there, but do we recognize him? Will we follow? And as I've experienced in my own life of faith, that saying yes to Jesus is a decision that can change the whole course of your story in the best possible way. And so today, what in your life needs resurrection power? What dead dreams, what broken relationships, what wounded hopes need to be touched by the life of Jesus? Because this isn't just ancient history that we're talking about today. This isn't just religious tradition. This is living reality that changes everything. And so I want to invite us to stand at this time. And I just want to pray a simple prayer over us before we can continue in our service. You can take whatever posture is comfortable for you. You can open your eyes. You can close your eyes if that's better. I tend to close my eyes because it helps me with distraction. If you want to, you can even put out your hands there's nothing magical or special about doing that. It's just like a sign of, God, I want you to do something in my life. It's just a sign of openness. But Jesus, we thank you for your life. We thank you for your death. We thank you for your resurrection. God, I acknowledge that we're coming into this space today from all kinds of different places, all kinds of different stories and backgrounds. But Lord, we believe that your heart for us today is that you are inviting us to say yes to you. To say yes to the greatest news of all time. Lord, whether we've been walking with you for a long time, Lord, if that's some of you today and you're like, I want to say yes once more to him, just invite you to say that under your breath. Yes. Yes, Jesus, I want you to be Lord of my life. I want my life to be centered in you and nothing else. But then maybe there's some of us today who are spiritually curious. We're seeking, we're wondering, what else is out there? What am I missing right now? And maybe even now there's just a sense that I want more in my life than I currently have. I want deeper anchors in my life. I want deeper roots. I want something that I've yet to be able to find on my own. And so if that's you and you want to say yes to Jesus in your own life today, I invite you just to say again under your breath, yes to Jesus. Jesus, I welcome you, invite you into my life. I thank you for your forgiveness. I thank you for your mercy. I thank you for your love. I thank you that you pursue me. You know me better than anyone on this planet knows me. You know me better than I know myself. And so I say yes to you today. Just like Mary in our passage turns her posture toward Jesus, Lord, whatever our starting point today, Lord, may we turn our posture toward you. And we thank you that you are so gracious, God, that you meet us exactly where we are. You meet us right here and right now in this very space, that you are here with us in this room by your Holy Spirit even right now. And so we thank you, Jesus, for who you are. We thank you for what you're doing in our lives, what you're doing in this Trinity Church family. We give you all thanks and praise. Say all this in Jesus' name. Amen.